All right, so today we're going deep on Julius Malema, a prominent and often controversial figure in South African politics.
Okay, yeah.
We've got a mix of BBC news articles and his Wikipedia page here, so should give us a pretty good picture. By the end of this deep dive, you'll understand not just his stances, but also why he provokes such strong reactions.
Yeah, he's a fascinating guy.
Yeah.
You see these really strong opinions about him. Champion of the people, voice for the marginalized. Then on the other side, reckless, populist, dangerous demagogue. I think the challenge for us is to go beyond those labels and really try to understand this complex man, a man who could very well play a significant role in shaping South Africa's future.
Yeah, absolutely. And to understand him, I think we need to start at the beginning. His Wikipedia page mentions that he joined the ANC at just 9 years old. 9 years old.
Right.
I mean, most kids at that age are worried about what's for lunch, not dismantling apartheid.
Right.
That's quite a start.
It really is. I mean, it speaks volumes about the political climate in South Africa at the time. I think that early immersion in activism seems to have had a really profound impact on how he approaches politics. You know, as he rose through the ranks, leading student protests, eventually becoming president of the ANC Youth League in 2008, he developed this style that was captivating and, as we've seen, quite confrontational.
And when we say confrontational, there's that infamous quote from 2008 where he said, and I quote, "We are prepared to take up arms and kill for Yuma."
Yeah.
Even in the world of fiery political rhetoric, that's a pretty intense statement. It really put him in the spotlight. But it also raised concerns about his judgment and his willingness to resort to extreme measures. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think that quote really highlights his tendency to push boundaries. He uses provocative language.
Yeah.
Make a point. You know, it's important to remember that at this time, he was a very strong supporter of Jacob Zuma. But as the BBC articles point out, their relationship took a very sharp turn. He ends up facing disciplinary action from the ANC, and eventually he was expelled in 2012. What do you think contributed to that breakdown? Was it purely political, or were there personal dynamics at play as well?
Well, the timeline suggests that his expulsion came right before the ANC's 2012 conference, where Zuma was seeking re-election. And by that point, Malema was very openly campaigning against Zuma, criticizing his leadership, criticizing his policies. So it's easy to see how Zuma might have seen him as a threat.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably a combination of factors, right? He was also facing some controversies at the time, accusations of corruption, even hate speech convictions. So it was probably a perfect storm that led to his downfall. But, as they say, every ending is a new beginning. Just a year later, he founds the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF. And that party has made a very significant impact on South Africa's political landscape.
They really stand out, with the red berets, the military-style outfits. It's very striking. So is that purely for show, or is there a deeper meaning behind that imagery?
Oh, it definitely plays a role in conveying their message. You know, those red berets symbolize revolutionary struggle, drawing parallels to figures like Che Guevara. And the military-style clothing, projects discipline, a readiness to fight for their cause. It resonates with people who feel marginalized and disenfranchised. And their success in the 2014 election, when they secured 25 seats in parliament, really shows that the Malema knows how to tap into the frustrations and the aspirations of a pretty big segment of the South African population.
It's remarkable for a new party. But, despite that success, or maybe because of it, controversy seems to follow Malema wherever he goes. We're talking about hate speech convictions, accusations of fraud, money laundering, the list goes on.
Yeah, I mean, we can't ignore these controversies.
Yep.
And it's crucial to look at them in context. So, for example, those hate speech convictions, they stem from him singing Dubli Apunu, an anti-apartheid struggle song, and from his comments about Jacob Zuma's rape accuser. So these incidents really sparked these heated debates about freedom of speech, the legacy of apartheid, and the very sensitive issue of racial tensions in South Africa.
One of the BBC articles mentioned a Botswana tirade. I'm not going to lie, I'd never even heard of that before. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, back in 2011, Malema publicly criticized the Botswana government, calling it a puppet regime. He even went as far as to suggest setting up a command team to assist opposition parties there, which of course caused a diplomatic incident. It raised questions about his, diplomatic skills and his judgment when it comes to international relations.
With all this baggage, it's kind of surprising to some that he's still seen as a potential leader, even a future president by some. So why do you think that is?
I think it's important to remember that he is a very powerful advocate for some very specific policies that resonate really deeply with certain segments of the population. EFF's call for nationalizing mines and expropriating land without compensation. That appeals to a lot of Black South Africans who believe they haven't truly benefited from the end of apartheid. So we're talking about some incredibly complex issues here, issues that are rooted in the country's long history of racial and economic inequality.
He really embodies a paradox, doesn't he? I mean, his Wikipedia page describes him as both a reckless populist and a future leader. So how do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory views of the same person?
It's tough, right? I mean, he has this knack for capturing attention, mobilizing supporters, giving voice to the grievances of a particular segment of society. But at the same time, his methods, his rhetoric, his legal troubles, they create this unease. It's difficult to separate the sincerity of his beliefs from his political maneuvering. So is he genuinely dedicated to these causes he champions? Or is he primarily a shrewd political opportunist?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It makes you wonder about his motivations. For example, take his recent comments about Hamas. He's openly expressed support for them, even suggesting he'd fund them if the EFF wins the 2024 election. So this stance on such a divisive international issue, I think, further complicates his image.
It does. It adds another layer of complexity to his persona, and it raises further questions about his political strategy. So is this a genuine expression of solidarity? Is it a calculated move to attract a specific voter base? Or maybe even an attempt to position himself as a Pan-African leader?
It's a bold move, to say the least. It's a gamble that could either pay off significantly or backfire spectacularly.
Yeah, for sure. Only time will tell what the outcome will be.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, from his early entry into politics to his rise and fall within the ANC and the establishment of the EFF. We've also touched upon some of those controversial statements and legal challenges.
Yeah, we've seen how those controversies,
Yep.
coupled with his undeniable charisma, have made him one of the most talked about and debated figures in South African politics.
But our deep dive isn't ending here. So in part 2, we're going to dig a little deeper into some of the specific controversies surrounding Malema, examine the incidents and their broader implications. We'll also explore the historical and economic roots of his policy stances and try to understand why they resonate so powerfully with a significant portion of the South African population.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive into the life and political career of Julius Malema.
As promised, we're going to dig a little deeper into some of those controversies that seem to follow him around
Okay,
shadow.
let's rewind back to 2010, when Malema was still a member of the ANC.
Ah, yes, the shoot the Boer controversy. I remember that one making headlines internationally.
Exactly, he repeatedly sang this controversial struggle song, despite a court ruling deeming it hate speech.
You know, it's interesting how music can be such a powerful force for unity and celebration. But it can also be used to incite division and even violence.
Absolutely. In this case, the song was perceived by many as a direct call to violence against white South Africans, evoking that painful and still very raw history of apartheid. How do you think this incident and Malema's defiance of the court ruling impacted public perceptions of him, particularly among different racial groups?
I think it further solidified his image as a provocateur, someone willing to push boundaries in court controversy, even if it meant inflaming racial tensions. But on the other hand, some might say he was simply expressing the anger and frustration felt by many Black South Africans who felt that the promises of equality and economic justice hadn't been fully realized.
Yeah, it definitely tapped into those deeper societal anxieties and resentments, particularly around issues of land ownership and economic inequality. And speaking of land, that seems to be a recurring theme throughout Malema's career.
Absolutely. His calls for land expropriation without compensation have been incredibly controversial.
It's a policy that goes right to the heart of South Africa's complex history, wouldn't you say?
Definitely, for many Black South Africans, it's about righting the wrongs of the past, reclaiming land that they believe was unjustly taken from them during colonialism and apartheid. It's about achieving a sense of ownership and control over their destiny.
But for others, it raises serious concerns about property rights, economic stability, and the potential for further racial conflict. Malema's proposals have sparked these intense debates among different stakeholders, with some experts warning of potential negative consequences for the economy. How do you see this issue playing out in the long term, given the deep emotions and historical baggage involved?
It's a tough question. I think there's a need for meaningful land reform to address the inequalities of the past. But it needs to be done in a way that's fair, just, and doesn't destabilize the country. It requires a delicate balance.
Delicate balance indeed. Moving on, we can't overlook the hate speech concessions. And I'm not just referring to the singing of the struggle song.
Right, the comments he made about Jacob Zuma's rape accuser in 2009 were particularly disturbing and drew widespread condemnation.
essentially blaming the victim, minimizing the severity of the allegations. These remarks raised serious concerns about his respect for women, his understanding of gender-based violence, and his overall judgment.
And this wasn't an isolated incident. He's made other questionable statements about women and traditional gender roles that have also been criticized.
Right. It's a pattern that's hard to ignore. And it does raise questions about his suitability for leadership. These incidents have fueled the debate about whether he's truly a champion of social justice for all, or if his commitment to equality is selective.
You know, it often seems like every time he takes a step forward, another controversy pulls him back. What do you think this cycle of progress and setbacks says about his political strategy and his ability to navigate the complexities of South African society?
It's a fascinating and at times frustrating pattern. He clearly possesses charisma and a talent for connecting with people, but his tendency to make impulsive and inflammatory statements often undermines his own progress.
So, as we look ahead to the 2024 elections, how do you see these controversies impacting his chances? Do you think they will ultimately hinder his political aspirations, or will he be able to overcome them and emerge as a more unifying figure?
That's the big question. The BBC articles highlighted some recent turmoil within the EFF, including the departure of his deputy, which is certainly a significant setback.
And his stance on Hamas could alienate moderate voters who might otherwise be sympathetic to his economic message.
You're absolutely right. Supporting such a divisive international figure is definitely a gamble, but taking risks seems to be a recurring theme in Malema's political playbook.
It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out in the upcoming elections. He's facing an uphill battle, but as we've seen throughout his career, he shouldn't be underestimated.
Indeed, only time will tell if he can channel his energy and ambition into constructive political leadership, or if these controversies will overshadow his potential. One thing's for sure, though, Julius Malema is a force to be reckoned with, and his story is far from over.
We've covered a lot of ground in this episode, exploring Malema's controversial past and the complexities of his political stances. But there's still more to uncover. In Part 3, we'll shift our focus to the broader implications of his rise and his potential impact on South Africa's future. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Julius Malema. So we've explored his personal journey, his controversial moments, and his really bold policy stances. Now I think it's time to zoom out a little and think about what his story tells us about South Africa today and its future.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Malema's trajectory really mirrors the complexities of post-apartheid South Africa. He embodies both the aspirations and the frustrations of a nation grappling with its past and striving for a more equitable future.
Going through these sources, one thing that really struck me was how he taps into those unfulfilled promises of the post-apartheid era. Apartheid officially ended decades ago, but its legacy continues to shape the social and economic landscape.
Oh, absolutely. Economic inequality remains a stark reality. Many Black South Africans feel they haven't fully benefited from the transition to democracy. And so Malema's message of radical economic transformation, with its focus on redistributing wealth and resources, it resonates very deeply with those who feel left behind.
It's almost as if he's holding up a mirror to South African society, forcing it to confront its uncomfortable truths and its unaddressed injustices. But do you think his approach, which some might consider confrontational and divisive, is it ultimately constructive, or could it actually exacerbate those tensions?
That's the key question, isn't it? His rhetoric really resonates with those who feel marginalized. It empowers them to demand change. But it also has the potential to alienate potential allies and actually hinder progress toward a more inclusive society.
Yeah, he seems to walk this tightrope between advocating for social justice and employing these populist tactics that could actually further polarize the nation. So is there a risk that his approach could create more division than unity?
Well, there's always that risk.
Sure.
But it's also important to remember that meaningful change often requires disrupting the status quo. You have to challenge those deeply entrenched power structures. And Malema's willingness to challenge the establishment, even if it means using provocative language, is seen by many as a sign of his authenticity and his commitment to his cause.
So looking ahead, what's your assessment of Malema's political future? Can he overcome these controversies and potentially become a unifying force for change? Or will his divisive tactics ultimately limit his influence?
Well, the upcoming 2024 elections will be a crucial test. We've already talked about those internal struggles within the EFF and the potential risks associated with his stance on Hamas. These factors could hinder his ability to broaden his appeal beyond his core base of supporters.
Do you think it's even possible for him to evolve his approach, to become a more inclusive leader without alienating that base? Or is his political persona so deeply entwined with this confrontational style that any attempt to moderate his tone would just be perceived as inauthentic?
It's a really difficult question. Political evolution is a delicate process. You
Yeah.
have to balance the expectations of your base with the need to appeal to a broader audience. So it remains to be seen whether Malema can navigate that transition successfully.
It is fascinating how his story, with all of its complexities and contradictions, reflects these broader challenges facing South Africa today. He really embodies the hope for change, the frustration with the slow pace of progress, and the anxieties about the future.
Yeah, and his trajectory, whatever it may be, will undoubtedly be intertwined with the fate of South Africa. He's a figure who forces us to grapple with these really difficult questions about race, inequality, justice, and the very nature of political leadership.
Well, that's it. Our deep dive into the world of Julius Malema has taken us from his childhood activism to the heights of political power. And through his fair share of controversy, we've examined his beliefs, his strategies, and the impact he's had on South Africa's political landscape.
Hopefully you now have a more nuanced understanding of this very complex and controversial figure and a deeper appreciation for the challenges and opportunities facing South Africa as it continues its journey toward a more just and equitable society.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We look forward to exploring more fascinating topics with you in future episodes.